successfully repurposed. And so a lot of these old manufacturing buildings, they were built solid, but there are certain things that when somebody goes and says, oh, why isn't somebody using that property? How do we help them with those type of things and answer those questions that don't initially come to my mind? So we'll get there. A lot of old churches out there have similar issues about, we'll talk about asbestos a whole lot tonight, because in my mind, it's the number one thing that halts projects on old buildings, is people don't consider the asbestos removal costs and how that can be done. Or a lot of times it's the fear of the unknown that can hold back a project. So we'll try to answer some questions about how to deal with asbestos, because it's in just about every old building, and what can you and can you not do, and things like that. And then, of course, you got your old buildings on the town square. They take every form, from the little shoebox house buildings to all sorts of, you name it. Old banks are a lot of times, or old post offices that get, somebody says, I've got this great idea. I'd like to reuse the old post office to be a restaurant or something like that. And we need to tear some stuff out to make the floor plan work. And then the question becomes, well, what in the past might be lingering there? Then how do we deal with those issues so that we can successfully make these projects get better? Because they don't get better with time if they're just vacant and the roof starts leaking, and then things just get worse. So hopefully we can breathe some life into these old buildings and keep them up, because at the end of the day, I love to see the old buildings put back into use, kept up, rather than them just tearing them down and sticking in another Dollar General right there or something like that. A couple of key takeaways for our program. Any public entity can apply, and you can even represent a privately owned property if there's a redevelopment benefit for the area. So let's say you've got an old gas station and somebody inherited it. They want to get rid of it, but they don't know how, because there's environmental questions. A historic preservation group, a local chamber of commerce, a city government, a county, any of those are applicable entities that can just ask for our help. We can pay for the environmental assessments out of our own pocket. So let's say somebody wants to sell a property. A lot of times there's a burden on either the buyer or the seller to pay thousands of dollars on these environmental assessments. So what the state can do, since we're funded by the EPA, specifically to help grease the wheels of these things and flatten the speed bumps, is we can absorb the cost of that. So neither the buyer nor the seller are burdened with it. And in that sense, we can make these properties sort of more marketable, more competitive, compared with just, a lot of times people love grabbing the vacant lot next door and they put whatever they want right there, and they leave the old eyesore behind for somebody else. So we're trying to make these properties recyclable in a way, and hopefully upcyclable, and that keeping the old facades and those type of things, that the old character of these areas. So the biggest thing an environmental assessment does is it separates liability of the previous environmental contamination for a new owner. So for example, let's say you're going to buy a property and you go to the bank and you say, I want to buy this old gas station. It's a great place to put my sandwich shop. And the bank says, great, where's your phase 1 report? And if you say, what's a phase 1 report? They're going to say, come back when you have a phase 1 report. By the way, it's going to cost you about $3,000. It's just a typical thing in the checklist, and you can't move forward without it. So that, at the very least, the reason they want a phase 1 is because they don't want to inherit liabilities of previous site conditions. And so that's one really silver bullet that people don't know about, is that people that are buying properties, you can have that liability protection from the previous site uses, but you have to do it before you purchase the property, because you have to establish that those issues are historical, not like, oh, I bought the property and then I just happened to find this thing that I buried after I bought the property. It won't hold up in court, type of thing. So, and again, assessments, no cost to the applicant. There's really no downside to applying. We have a very simple application. It's a 2-pager. We're not an enforcement program. We're not here to come stick fines on people. If we were, nobody would ever use our program. We're a voluntary program. We try to help people redevelop their properties or make them marketable or get them to a better and higher use. So again, we're here to help. We're not here to come hide in the bushes and write you fines and tickets and things. That's just not how it works. And one more thing, this time in history, and we're a couple of years in now to all these various large infrastructure bills and ARPAs and Inflation Reduction Acts of the world, but there was a massive amount of money appropriated for brownfield projects at the federal level. And it was like 5 times the amount that they were used to working with on an annual basis. So there is quite a bit of money to do these environmental assessments. So I would say it's a much less competitive grant than most people would think it is. If you have a project in mind, reach out to us. There's a very good chance we can get it in the pipeline to get it done. So when we do phase 1, that's kind of like essentially a background check on a property. We'll talk more in detail about what that does and says and all that type of thing. For that, anybody who likes to play property detective, you might find these interesting to actually read. A phase 2 report is sort of the next level beyond that. It's not just a background check on a property. It's saying there's some things we want to investigate. So we start doing things like taking samples of soils and waters and checking whether materials have asbestos, things like that. If there's a finding of that, then you can decide whether or not you want to enter a phase 3, which is you want to remove the contamination or work around it to make it fit with how you're trying to reuse the site. So you try to minimize the risks, but I also forgot to update my date on there. I apologize. Nonetheless, always pick up the phone. I'm happy to talk to you. All these things. We'll get tons of time to ask questions. And I apologize if I get too ramped up for Monday night, but I'm really excited to talk about this stuff. One other thing to keep in mind is we do a Brownfields conference every year. We do it at Lake of the Ozarks, which used to be called Tantera. If you're an old timer, I know it as Tantera. Now it's Margaritaville. It's still fun. We have a good time. We do a conference there. It's part of a much larger conference. And the best part is we do 50 scholarships a year. We can cover people's registration costs to come to the conference, learn about Brownfields projects, all the various topics I'll go into. We'll have an hour session on each one of these things that I try to talk about for 2 minutes. So if that sounds like your kind of thing where you find these things to be applicable, think about coming. If you're traveling more than 150 miles, we can get you a hotel room too. If you get into projects and you need letters of support, again, I'm happy to provide those type of things. I'm always happy to come do a site visit, do a stakeholder outreach, just eyeball a property, explain things to city councils, answer questions. That's what I'm here for. It's your tax dollars at work, and I encourage you to make use of it. So do we have any Simpsons fans here? Particularly the old Simpsons? Okay, well, too bad. You're gonna have to suffer through my Simpsons love anyways. So here's a classic example of somebody that thinks they're sitting on a pile of gold and it's got history to it. Like, oh, you want me to sell Storytime Village? Well, you got to be off your Tuffet. Here it is falling apart. But oh wait, I forgot. I can actually donate the park as a tax write-off. So never forget that there's always somebody that forgets they own something, and then they can magically sometimes be persuaded in various ways, shapes, and forms. So another common one is a tax foreclosure. Anybody ever been to a tax foreclosure sale? They're weird, fascinating events, but you never know what you're going to wind up seeing and hearing about. And a lot of times they're just really oddball properties, and there's usually a reason why they're for sale. But anyways, this Simpsons episode, this item 751 comes up. Bart has no idea what he's bidding on, so he bids $1. And what do you buy? He wound up buying this old factory, And so the episode it's great. It's one of my favorites. He gets to have a good time, just like any high schooler, middle schooler would dream about, just all the shenanigans you could get into. Anyways, he says, first I started falling over, and then it fell over. I wonder where all the rats are going to go. So anyways, put it in, there's 16 different ways you could say it, but all in all, we can do these assessments, these environmental assessments at no cost. So seriously, take use of them. A lot of times you will be surprised at how often the environmentals have not been done on a property, and somebody that's interested, they might be weighing a few different projects in their mind, and this can be one of them. So we can help get that speed bump taken ahead of time to make these properties more marketable. Here's the big overview of how these projects go. It sounds more complicated than it is, but it's always way overgeneralized as well. So we can talk about this all day. If you guys are so interested, I encourage you to come to Lake of the Ozarks. We can talk all about each one of these phases and things. But essentially, you're trying to work with owners to get the property to a better use. So back to the phase one. Phase one, it's kind of a background check of a property. We call the results of a phase one a recognized environmental condition, which stands for REC. It's the presence or potential presence of hazardous substances or petroleum products, things like that on a property. So a lot of times the age of the building alone is a qualifier, like, oh, this building was built in 1930. There's a good chance there's asbestos, you know, in various things. And so a lot of times we can help sort out, does it all need to be treated as asbestos, or is there just certain areas that have it? And as long as you don't disturb them, that may be okay. So if you ever get the chance to look at a phase one, some of them are quite long and some of them are, but really it's an interesting bit of history where they do a site description, you go digging through the records as far back as you can find. A lot of times it's an old Sanborn fire insurance map, or it may be old tax records, or they may be interview records. They'll talk to the neighbors and say, what did you used to think this thing was? And all those type of things. And it's really just trying to gather as much information as they can about what did this always used to be as far back as we can find, because otherwise nobody knows and it could be anything. And it really helps to figure out the feasibility of a project at the next step. So with that being said, it's a site summary. It's kind of like a background check on a property. It's a history. It's not saying whether it does or does not have contamination. It's just identifying the potential things in its history that can be, that are worth investigating or at least being aware of, because otherwise people may have never heard of the word asbestos and without one of these. It happens all the time. So they're pretty neat records. If you have a project in mind and it doesn't have a phase one and you ask about it and nobody can find it, let us know. We can do a new one. It's pretty interesting piece of documentation, and it's really required on the commercial lending front to get a project moving forward in financial world. So just out of curiosity, has anybody ever seen or heard of a phase one before? All right. Well, then this is all fresh. So here's some examples of things we would consider a recognized environmental condition. So dry cleaners are one of the most notorious things. Oh, sorry, auto advance. Okay. Dry cleaners, their solvents were not very good. A lot of times those dry cleaners were located, for example, in the old town square. Lawyer's got to drop off his suit after work, something like that. It's across the street from the county courthouse all the time. So the history of what the business used to be can really define whether the property is marketable or not for a redevelopment project. Now, that's not to say that the project can't be redeveloped. It's just it needs an environmental investigation to more fully understand, are there still potential lingering issues, or is this site as ready to go as anything else? Other examples, petroleum storage tanks, old mechanical systems, the old boiler rooms in the basements of these buildings where they used to have all the pipe rafts were typically done in asbestos a lot of times. And so for somebody that didn't know any better, they might just tear that stuff out and it would be floating all over and it would not be a good thing to do. So at the very least, the minimum recommendations are to contain it, to not disturb it if possible. And if you do have to disturb it, essentially they'll make a plastic coated room. They just kind of staple up some plastic sheeting essentially. They put it under a negative pressure, so it's kind of like using a fan to remove, to kind of filter the air, but just so it's not just floating around. And ideally, they try to keep the materials wet when they're working with them, as long as, and I'll talk about asbestos more than anything, because really it probably is the most applicable thing for any old building. As long as the asbestos doesn't become dry and airborne, it's really not nearly as hazardous. So a lot of times they'll keep them wet. By keeping it wet, it keeps it from turning into a dust, which would affect somebody. And of course, old pesticides, used it on fence rows to kill things that didn't want growing, and all the cockroaches and things I found in the basement here the other day. Some really good old stuff that had lead arsenate in it, just a little old box from it, but you never know, from 100 years ago. Other things that come across a lot, old landfill dump sites. A lot of times there was the old town dump where that was just what they did. They would pile the trash there, they would burn it off, and then they'd keep piling it up. Well, once the EPA come and shut them down, back in the 70s or something like that, a lot of times they would just put topsoil over it and call it a day. They may be an uncapped landfill, for example. So figuring out that site history by looking at old aerial photography, things like that, can help identify whether that has always been a vacant piece of ground, for example, or whether that historic property, maybe it also had a junkyard in the back, or various odds and ends. So these are notorious areas for environmental concerns. And of course, the old transformers from back in the day, the old power lines, as long as they didn't leak, they were fine. But if they leaked, you could have some soil contamination issues, PCBs, things like that. There's a laundry list of chemicals and alphabet soup we could talk about, but I think hopefully you don't have any of that. If you do, reach out. We're happy to talk in detail about any of those things. The number one and number two that I run into in old buildings, lead-based paint and asbestos. Now, the one recommendation I have about lead-based paint more than any one thing is if you keep the air conditioning on, it keeps the paint from peeling. The humidity, a lot of times an old building gets shut down, they open the windows up, they turn the air conditioning up, they turn the power off, and all that paint that was stuck to the walls and not dangerous, if it's still encapsulated or stuck, it starts peeling off, and then you start coming in and there's just everywhere lead dust, and it makes a mess. And it was the miracle thing, and we put it in everything. Asbestos, there's multiple different things. Asbestos in general is a mineral, but we talk about asbestos containing materials. So they used to be in, like, for example, old flooring, window caulks, the glue that would hold the old flooring down. It could be in insulation on pipe wraps. It could be on ceiling, popcorn ceilings. It was just, oh, it prevents fire. It must be great. Put it in everything. Old theaters like we were talking about. So if you have to remove it, it can be much more expensive than just a standard demolition type of work would be to rehab a building. So that's why I recommend, if there's just based on the age of the buildings you're dealing with, if you have any questions, we can come out, they can do the sampling of the materials, we'll pay for that. And that can help you decide, like, is all of the flooring asbestos, or is maybe there just a little utility closet that has it? And the other questions can be like, can we just cover over it? Yes, you can. So there's a lot of different ways to try to make these projects as economically feasible as possible, because we know that the environmental unknowns can really hinder, hamper, slow down, bog down, keep your old building stuck looking like it, not like it used to back in the good old days, but like it has the last 20, 30 years, where it's just sitting there getting worse with time because nobody can figure out how to fund it, how to redevelop the site. And a lot of times the stigma of a property can really hold it back. I love this old ad, the Dutch Boys Lead Party, because boy, it made the paint stick and it made it held up. But put it in everything, it was the miracle stuff. Things we don't consider, recognized environmental contaminants or concerns. We don't, in Missouri at least, we don't consider old septic tank systems. That's not beyond our cause. Radon is just a naturally occurring thing in basements, essentially. It's kind of a standard thing, so we don't consider that in our program as one of our areas of concern. Bird droppings, you'd be amazed at what you can find in old buildings, the amount of what they call it guano that piles up. We don't consider that an environmental contaminant. That's kind of more of a standard, just remove it. And then mold. Some states do consider it an environmental contaminant. We don't, in Missouri, consider that specific environmental contaminant, although it has certain health effects and issues. It's just not classified in Missouri that way, so that's the way it is. A phase two, if you have a phase one, based on the age of the property, a lot of times they can go and say, recommend a phase two. And a lot of times that'll involve doing some boring samples so they can collect various dirt, and a lot of times they'll kind of guess at what the area used to be. So they're not just blindly digging holes, but they're kind of like, well, this area we knew was where the parking lot was, or where the gas tanks used to be. So that's the area we want to sample, because you can never do a complete, thorough, exhaustive investigation. It's really a feasibility level study of, is it better than we thought? Is it worse than we thought? Is it about average of what we thought? You really don't know until you get samples. And after the first round of samples, you can decide, do we need to do more sampling, or is this good enough to give us a general overview on how to proceed? And so they'll be pretty detailed. They're scientific reports. Some of these reports can be 700 pages of lab results and things like. But if you read the summary, usually there's a pretty good couple-page summary that puts it into non-scientific terms of the general things to be concerned about. So that way, when you go to do a project, you know what you're dealing with, because really turning the unknowns into a known, that's the biggest thing. So the environmentals don't hold back the site progress. A lot of times there'll be boring logs, which can be interesting. If you don't know what the geology of the area is underneath it, that some people find that very interesting. Some people don't. And then, of course, the lab data. And it's, like I said, it's a very scientific report. There's interpretations, there's conclusions, but all in all, these can be more like, whereas a phase one might be, let's say, $2,000 to $3,000, these can easily be $20,000 to $30,000. Or even for your large industrial sites, they can be $200,000. So the fact that they can be paid for really does add value to the site to make it on par with, the vacant property next door, so to speak. After all that, you've got your results in hand, and you want to know the bottom line up front of how much is this going to cost me? And the question is always, well, it depends. So we do these things that's called an analysis of brownfield cleanup alternatives, otherwise known as an ABCA, since we love acronyms. And essentially that says, it gives you three options. Option number one, if I don't do any cleanup, what can I use the property for? What can I not use it for? Cost is zero. Okay, that's option one. Option two, if I do a full cleanup, so this site has no restrictions, I can put, a daycare in the basement type of thing, or whatever you want to do. There's no restrictions, there's no thing. What does that type of remediation look like, and how much, more importantly, is that going to cost? Because if it's not economically feasible, it never happens, almost always. So option one is at one end, option two is at the complete other end, and then option three is kind of like, what's the middle ground look like? What is clean enough for the most likely reuse of the project as feasible? And so they might say, well, you can leave, as long as you don't remove all the lead paint, if you cover over it or you don't disturb it, you can keep that. That'll cost you not much. If you don't remove the asbestos flooring, you can put asbestos flooring, or you can cover over that flooring. That'll keep your costs down. It's when you start removing things that, so it's kind of making all these trade-offs of saying, what's clean enough where it's not a health or hazard risk, but you're not going overboard and spending more money, because if the project is uneconomically feasible, the property just stays stuck and never moves forward. So they're trying to find that happy medium of what's the most reasonable, most likely economic middle ground if you don't want to choose one over the other. And so when you get to these evaluation to cleanup alternatives, a lot of times, like I said, since we love acronyms, this one's called MRBECA, which stands for Missouri Risk-Based Corrective Action Technical Guidance. Essentially, it's saying, how do we minimize risks? Because not everything has the same risk. If you're putting a house there, you don't want to find out that, oh, my house is built on a landfill. You don't want to have any restrictions on a house like that. If you're going to use an old industrial site, you're going to maybe use it for a new industrial site, or you're going to use it for commercial where kids aren't digging in the soil and putting dirt in their mouth. It's let's say it's a concrete floor. There's just different levels of risk based on the various things. So I've got a whole room of scientists that love to figure out this stuff and figure out how to keep people safe. We're happy to talk to you all about this stuff as much as you want. But essentially, it boils down to your three alternatives in an ABCA: do nothing, perfectly clean, and what's in between. So here's an example success story that I like to talk about. This is in California, in Montauk County. It was an old gas station, high visibility corner. And for example, on this project, they needed, well, the thing they were looking to do is put in a new county jail. Their old one was falling apart and certainly not somewhere I would want to spend any time. So the perfect place to put it is, of course, right on the site where you have your biggest eyesore, your biggest challenge. Reutilize that site, and then you can keep your better real estate, your kind of pristine real estate, for something better down the road, for example. So anyways, long story short, it was the perfect place to do it. They were able to keep some of the facade and keep the character of the area as much as a county jail can offer. This isn't the best example, but I do find it an interesting example in that it's not particularly glamorous. There's many stories of glamorous old rehab properties. We all know them. We all aspire to them. They don't all have to be shiny, but they can be. And there's tons of those. Here's another thing to think about when you're dealing with historic properties. How do you make the property, sometimes there's like a vacant area next door to it, for example. So half the question is, how do you activate that space so it's not just a fenced off area or a parking lot, but how can you kind of invite people to spend some time there? And there's a lot of interesting work being done on the little things you can do, for example, that make that area have some vibrancy to it. And so I think those things are always worth considering. There's like Missouri Main Streets program, for example, and they can tell you just how much seating you need and where the lighting should be and the little things you can do. Have you thought about putting a little putt-putt course next to the old bank? And if people are around, then maybe the business can survive there that, wants to have the little bakery in the old post office or things like that. So I mention it because sometimes people overlook it in getting so focused on the site that they don't look at the site next door. And a lot of times the site next door can affect the site. We have these partners at Kansas State University. They have fantastic services. They work, again, for $0 out of your pocket. They're paid by the EPA to basically be on retainer for anybody that has a potential project and they want to do something with it. Maybe you don't even know what you want to do with it, but you're like, we have this old property. Where do we start? They can help with that. They do things like, they'll come and talk to your city council with me. They'll come host a community visioning session where people say, what do we do with the old post office that's fallen apart? Well, I want a game shop, or I want a bakery, or whatever it can be. I want a history museum. There's a cool one in Deloge. Yeah, they had a cool one there. Anyways, I got off track. These people are awesome. They work so tirelessly, and they are always happy to help. And I'm always happy to refer people to them. All we need is a one-sentence email saying, hey, I've got a property. I'd like to have some help making this move forward, and we can just jump on it from that. There's no application process. It's not competitive. I find the need, I find the resources, I put them together, and I say, let's see what we can get cooking here. So other types of things that they can help prepare to get these projects sort of off the ground. Well, nobody will ever do the project for you, but we will help get the ball rolling, so to speak. They can do economic feasibility analysis. They can help you figure out more sustainable solutions for a site development. Can help sort out environmental justice issues, which is a whole nother talk in and of itself, and I won't even go into that. But essentially, it's saying a lot of impoverished areas have environmental challenges disproportionate to wealthy areas. And so it can help sort through those type of issues as well, sort through funding sources, sort through tax credits, all these type of, it's free help. All you have to do is ask. So if you don't ask, you don't get help. But if you do ask, I almost guarantee you, hopefully we can find some way to help you out. So you can also say, we've got these phase 1 reports. They're too complicated for me to understand. Can you help review them and give me an understanding of what does this mean? And again, they're always happy to help. So encourage folks to make use of that. I know we're getting a little close to time. I almost done my presentation, then we can move on to questions here. One more plug I want to make. We do this, conference. It's really a pleasure to put on every year. We have 50 scholarships available again this year. Go ahead and put the date on your calendar if you have any interest in coming. And if you'd like to secure your spot, the sooner you apply, the better. If you can always just shoot me an email, ask me about it, and I can give you more details. But we really try to balance it, something for everybody. So I think my recipe for this year is going to be a mix of what we'll call Brownfields 101 and Brownfields 202. So we'll kind of start off in the morning pretty general, and then we'll get midway through the day, we'll kind of get mid-level of depth balancing with breadth. And then kind of towards the end of the day, we'll get really into the more finer points for the latest and greatest in Brownfields. If people need to leave early, then that's the perfect time to do that. So I truly try to make it something that anybody that hasn't ever come feels comfortable coming to. And folks that have already come, hopefully they're excited to come back. So I would encourage you all to consider putting that on your calendar. We've got a whole website. It's full of resources. It's full of materials. Again, I talk about this stuff for 40 plus hours a week. Seriously, pick up the phone anytime, give me a call. And again, the key takeaways: a public entity can apply even on behalf of a private entity. The environmental assessments separate the liability of the previous site uses. We do those at no cost, and there's tons of money in this world right now through 2026 to do these things. So keep the ball rolling. If you don't know, feel free to reach out and ask. Here's my contact info again, and I guess maybe it's a good time to go ahead and take any questions that people might have.
Oh, Jacob, we did have one question. Would you be able to make these slides available to us to send out to the attendees?
Yes, absolutely. Oh. I'm going to make sure I send those out to you.
My name is Ed James, and I'm with the city of Normandy.
Normandy, okay.
I have a couple of questions. One,
okay.
Do we need let's say that we're a public entity, but we cannot or have problems finding the owner. Do we have to have the owner 100% on board before we apply for these?
Hang on. I got a lot of feedback there. Let me try muting my microphone, and maybe you can ask that again. Give me 1 second here while I figure out my side. I'm going to go ahead and stop.
I thought it was just me.
Let's see.
How was that?
Oh.
That's okay. I think I can maybe I can text you the question.
Hey, Edward, if you don't mind, maybe type your question in the chat.
Okay. Thank you.
I heard the question. He said he's asking whether he needs the owner's permission or documentation from the owner if he's trying to apply for a project as a public entity.
Very good question. And the answer is yes. The owner has to be willing to let people come on their property. If they're not, we can't force them. We're not going to try to force anybody. If it's an enforcement issue, it's really a complete different basket of what we deal with. We deal with people that have to be worked with. So that being said, if they have any hesitations, questions, a lot of people are like, government coming on my property to do environmental assessments. I don't know about that. Feel free to refer them to me. I'm happy to talk them through everything we do and don't do and why they should consider it, because there's not a downside for them. It's not that they're going to get stuck with a fine or something like that. So really we're there on the property owner's behalf to try to do whatever they're trying to do with the property, be it sell the property, be it rehab the property, things like that. But yes, key piece is the consent of the property owner.
Thank you.
Oh, Jacob, we had a question from Elaine. She asked if you do the assessment, then the liability would not pass to the new owners, even if they choose to not do a full cleanup?
Essentially, that's correct. Yeah. So the reason being is that if you can establish that the contamination was there before you acquired the site, then that's a pre-existing site condition. You didn't cause that. And so that's what makes these properties marketable. Before this It's called the Small Business Act. Before that existed, nobody wanted to buy any property because they're like, what if I find something I don't like? It's my problem. And so the key piece there is you have to have one of these phase 1 environmental assessment reports from 6 months or less before the property was closed on. If you didn't do that before the property is closed on, you just bought it with a duffel bag full of cash, for example, not knowing anything about it. Believe me, it happens all the time. If you can't establish that it wasn't your problem before you got the property, then it's kind of still your problem. But if you want to pass it off to somebody, it's not their problem as long as they do their due diligence of having one of these reports prepared ahead of time. So yes, you are not required to do a cleanup. There's a lot of liability protections in place that are very valuable. Of course, speak with a lawyer if you're concerned. I can give you my nickel version, but I don't charge anything for my advice right now. So that's about how much it's worth. Maybe slightly more than zero, but.
Oh, we have a question from Shelby in Pleasant Hill. She says the city acquired a property and cannot locate a phase 1 environmental on a former gas station. Before we sell to a new owner, we know that we'll need one. Is this eligible?
Yes, we can likely help you with that. So
Okay, yeah, we thought we heard mixed things a little bit on whether it had to be done beforehand or if you could do one if you didn't have it. So thank you for that clarification.
Yeah, if you're trying to pass the property to a new owner, they're going to definitely want that before they take it. And basically any bank is going to say, where's your phase 1 before we'll take this? So rather than them having to cough up the thousands of dollars to do this, or you having to pay the thousands, you might as well let us spend our budget on it for you. So yes, sounds like a common property, and there's tons of old gas stations out there, and they're probably the #1 most common site that I deal with. And they're always in high visibility areas, and a lot of times they haven't been touched in many, many decades. So Excelsior Springs, yes, indeed. Thanks, Melinda. How's everything going with the Hall of Waters?
Well, we could always use more money for that project. and we know we have asbestos because we found it during our Save America Treasures grant. And the biggest thing that scares us is not being able to not having enough money to address all of the abatement. So can you talk a little bit, maybe even to explain how, what that means? If we were to get some type of a grant and it won't take care of all of the abatement and we don't have the funding for that, what would be our options?
So one big pot of money that can be had is the EPA Brownfields grants. They have cleanup dollars available. Let's say on the order of $500,000 would not be unusual at all to ask for a property. Now, as we know, EPA, there's going to be a fair bit of paperwork involved. It's not an easy grant application. It takes some community involvement and a bit of background. But that being said, that's a large pot of money specifically for the environmental remediation on a site. So if it goes, and truly, if the project is held back by the cost of environmental cleanup, that's where these grants really shine, because they say they fill that particular category. Because you can go and you can put together a financial stack of historic tax credits that cover this. Maybe you can get some sidewalk improvement funds from that. And maybe you can get some broadband money, and here's some, money to replace the lead water lines, things like that. But specifically in the environmental cleanup category, the EPA has the biggest pot of money available. It's not easy to get, but it's not impossible either. And typically we're seeing about 1/3 to 1/2 of the applications get approved. So it takes some time, it takes some energy, it takes some resistance to frustration of reading through grant guidelines, but it can really make or break the difference between a project happening and perpetually being in the where we're going to find the money to do the cleanup type of thing. So
Jacob,
that's definitely the biggest one.
And I would say that we did the resource roadmap We got some help to do that, and that helped us to identify the Save America Treasures grant, and that was $1 million. And so if you've not considered looking at what KSU Tab can do to help you, I think EPA helped with that resource roadmap. I think that was the group that helped us. That's how we identified the funding source and we're able to get the funding. So definitely recommend that program as well.
That's great. You said that was called the Save American Treasures Act?
We got the Save America Treasures grant, and that's $1 million. It was 500,000 from them, 500,000 from us. You can only get it one time, so you can't go back and get it again. But the resource roadmap was put together and helped us to identify where resources were that we should be applying for. So definitely worth considering doing if you've not done that yet.
Excellent point. And yeah, right now there's so much funding floating around. Nobody can keep track of it all. It's really at a different scale. Some of these things are just, there's a new one called RAISE. I don't even remember what it stands for, but it's a whole big bill of funding packaging for all these type of things. So yes, KSU is a fantastic partner to help sort through all the different funding streams that are coming from every different direction. And a lot of times those regional planning commissions also are great clearinghouses for, hey, what's all the latest and greatest coming from, Missouri Division of Economic Development, or what the various funding sources that you can pile up into a stack. And the stack is the difference between a project happening and not happening. So excellent recommendation. And thanks, Melinda. I really look forward to making it out there and getting to see your project site firsthand. I see another question here. We don't deal with radioactive contamination. Partially true. A lot of times those are regulated by a different part of DNR. So we don't deal with that much in brownfields. It's an unusual thing for brownfield, but there are other parts of DNR, typically more like the Superfund section, that deals with those type of sites. Because usually that type of radioactive contamination is, the one thing I should clarify, the difference between a Superfund site and a brownfield is, the brownfield is only, the contamination is contained to the property, whereas a Superfund, it could be spreading to the neighborhood and making its way into neighboring properties. That's really the key piece that separates brownfield, which is not enforceable because you're not polluting the neighborhood, whereas a Superfund is enforceable and it's an entirely different machine that runs, but it's protecting public health because somebody else's property is affecting you, for example. So hopefully that's clear as mud. I know a lot of the old military sites around St. Louis, for example, have a lot of history of that. And those tend to go the Superfund route instead of the brownfields route.
Does anybody else have any more questions for Jacob? If not, Jacob, thank you very much for doing this tonight. And thank everyone for attending. And if you like this, we'll try to do some more of these in the future. So this was kind of an experiment. So Jacob, you were like our first one doing the evening webinar. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I appreciate you all folks taking your evening to sit here and listen to me talk about brownfields. So if you want to talk more, feel free. Again, I'll send the slides out. You got my contact info. Let's talk. We'll make it happen, whatever it is. So thanks, everybody, and keep up the good work.